a folder stack here for you guys. So they say move into your project directory, create a folder, which will be Cheese Hub, call it whatever you want. So I've already done that. And we're going to start with the backend. So we're going to start with the server. Now, Thinkful has a template repository, which is really nice. It has a lot of stuff set up for us, and it gets us out the gate quickly when we're developing our backend. The repository is this link here. So what I've done is the first step is to clone it. And if I go into my server folder, I have already cloned it just to save time for me watching me install the dependencies. So I ran git clone and then the server, and then I npm installed here, and I got all my node modules. Okay. So at this point, we'll have a look at the next step in npm install. I've already done that. So I can create a new repository. Let's go ahead and do that now really quick. So come up here and we'll call it ch19. Call it full stack backend. Go ahead and create that. And because locally we clone this from Thinkful, I don't need to do a git init here. I just need to set the URL. I need to tell where this repository is going to be pointing to. Right now it's pointing to Thinkful's, so I can do git remote, set URL, and then paste my repository. Okay, git remote, set URL. I think I just forgot the origin. Okay, and at this point, I'll go back to my steps here, and we can go ahead and maybe just do a push to GitHub just for sanity. Git add, git commit, -m, first commit, and then a git push. And we'll come back and refresh my repository that I just created there just to check. And we can see now the code is on my repository, okay? So at this point, I just have my repository for my backend. I haven't done anything exciting yet, but I'm just getting everything set up. It's the most important thing. Take your time walking through the setup. It's not a race, okay? So I've kind of done all the steps they've told me to here, but at this point, I would like to check if this repository works, because I did clone it from Thinkful, and I want to check what's in the code base, because I didn't write the code. So if I open up the backend here in my text editor, which is Adam, you can see we're given quite a few files. A lot of this should be familiar to you. If I go into the index.js, which is basically their server.js, you can see here that we are importing a few things at the top. So I'll run through it pretty quickly. And you'll, again, today, guys, your job is to do this. So you'll be more than familiar with the code by the end of the walkthrough today. So they bring in Express, they bring in this cores library, so we can configure what front end can send AJAX requests to our backend. They bring in Morgan for doing logging. I don't use this too much myself. It's more for the developer to see the logs in the server when someone accesses your server. And then they're bringing some variables from this config file here. And then we're creating our Express server. So now they're setting up Morgan here, which you don't have to do this. This is just for nice logs in the console when you access your server. And this guy's pretty important. app.use cores, origin, and client origin. So this line of code here is going to tell our server who is allowed access it or not, which is good because when we're in production, we mightn't want any person just accessing our server from AJAX. So we kind of prevent hacking as well a little bit, okay? And now we have our run server function here. So this is all pretty like bog standard stuff. It's boilerplate. And they've just separated out here the database stuff into a DB mongoose file. And you can see here they're doing mongoose.connect inside this function, okay? And then they're importing database URL from a config file. And then they have a disconnect and a get as well. Again, you guys don't have to worry too much in writing all this because this template is to get you started, okay? If you decide to use Postgres, then you have your DB connects file here to connect to your Postgres database, okay? So if we have a look in the config file, we can see that we have some variables that are equal to some process.envs, which we haven't set up. You usually set them up in Heroku, so we can protect any sensitive information. Because we're going to be working locally here for a second, we're going to be using all the ORs here, as we can see. So all these values are going to be used. And you can see here for the client origin, we're saying when it's not in production, i.e. when we don't have an env variable, we're going to use localhost 3000. And that's going to be our React app that's going to be running on localhost 3000. So that is going to be allowed access or server, because in here we said cores, the origin will be the variable client origin, which is going to be this variable from our config file. Okay. So at this point, we can have a nice boilerplate for our backend here. What I might do is I might just add a simple endpoint here called API/test. What I'm going to do with this endpoint is I'm just going to go ahead and send back a JSON response, the message of hello Ray, okay? So if I go ahead and come back to my command line to start up my server, I can do node mon index.js, and my backend is now running on 8080 locally. I can come over here and I can go to localhost 8080. We'll get a cannot get because I do not have an endpoint for the root, but I created an endpoint called API/test, and we can see we now get our JSON, okay? So at this point, I have a backend kind of set up, a nice little repository from Thinkful as we saw there. So we don't really have to do a lot of setting up ourselves. We just have to worry about at this point, adding our endpoints and maybe adding some express router if you want to organize your code more, and adding Mongoose, okay? I won't be going to Mongoose in this workshop. That's a bonus goal for today, so I don't want to spoil it. I want to give you the chance to attempt that and practice that. So at this point, my backend is set up. We will be deploying it to Heroku later on, but I'm going to work locally at first, and then we're going to push our client and our backend to production at the end of the workshop. So at this point, I have a backend set up. Come back to instructions, and now they want me to set up a client. So we're going to switch gears a little. We're going to move from the backend to the front end. And to do that, we're going to be using React and Redux, what you guys have been doing over the past 2 weeks. And what they want me to do is they want me to go into my projects folder. So I'll come to my command line here. I'll open a new tab just to keep it nice and organized. And I'll come out of my server folder. And now I'm inside my project folder. So what they want me to do is they want me to create a new app using the Create React app. So I can go ahead and copy this, and I don't mind calling it client. That makes sense. So go ahead and run that command, and that's going to create a React app for us called client. So this will take a little bit of time, guys. And while that's installing, what I can do, so we're not all just sitting here watching dependencies install, not the funnest thing to do, I can create a repository for my front end. So you notice at this point, the front end is on its own repository, and the back end is on its own repository. That's a nice little architecture in the real world. So you can kind of separate the back end from the front end. So when your front end developers are working, you don't cross wires, okay? It's nice to separate them out. If you think of a piece of paper, on the left-hand side, we'll have our client repository, and on the right-hand side, we'll have our back-end repository. So we're really separating things to make it very organized. So I'll call this CH19. I have a back-end, so I'll call it client, and we'll go ahead and create a repository. Okay. Come back, see if this is still installing. So we're good. This is after setting up here. So I can go ahead and go into my client folder, and I'm going to do an ls. So we have all the starter files from the React app. So at this point, I'll just set up my version control, i.e. I'll get it on GitHub. So I need to run git init because this is not a Git repository yet. I'll go ahead and do my commit here. I don't need a README for now. Oh, before I do that, I actually have to add. Whoops. Then I'll do my git commit. And then I'll add my origin, where it's going to be going to. And finally, I only have to do this guy once, by the way. And then finally, I can go ahead and push to GitHub. And come back and refresh and just make sure my code is there. And we can see my code is here, okay? So at this point in my GitHub, I now have my front-end repository and I have my back-end repository. So I'm nice and organized. And you can see I'm taking it very slowly, and this is what you guys should be doing. There's no need to rush this. It's really important to get like the templates set up, the skeleton apps, the hello world, okay? Because once you get that, you're really off to a good start. It makes you building an app a lot easier. So come back to my React app, and we've set it up. We have version control set up. They want us to install a few dependencies, and they want us to install dependencies relating to Redux. So let's go ahead and do that, because the Create React app does not give us Redux by default. So I need to install Redux, React Redux, and Redux Tunk. So let's click enter here. And we'll just wait. These guys shouldn't take too long to install. Come on. Here we go. Cool. So what I can do is I'll open my front end in Atom as well. Okay, so I have my front end opened here, and this should be pretty familiar from the last 2 weeks, guys. This is our React app. So this is the Create React app, what we get when we start. And we have our index.js here, and we have our app.js. So we'll have to add to this. At this point, what I might do is I am going to be using Redux for my app. So I will go ahead and get Redux set up. So this is a nice time now for people to refresh on setting up Redux, and I'm going to go through the steps here, okay? So the first thing I do with any project is I have my shell here, and now I'll create a few folders in my source. And I'll create a folder for my actions. Open this guy up. I'll create a folder for my reducers, and then I'll create a file here for my store.js, okay? So I will start off, and I'll create my Redux store, which is going to be storing our state. So I'm going to import create store, and that's coming from the Redux library. And I can go ahead and create my store variable, which I can call whatever I want. And it's going to be equal to calling the create store method from Redux, which we imported here. So that's going to create a Redux store. Now, this is going to expect us to give it a reducer that's going to be managing the state, but we have not created one yet. So for now, we'll leave it blank, and I'll just come down here and export default my store. The reason I export it is I will be using this guy in a little while. So I have my store created, nice simple store there. I'll now come to my reducers, and I'll create my reducer. For this little demo, I only have one reducer here. So let's say I was building an app that just managed user contacts. I might just create a user.js file here. Inside here, I'll create my initial state variable, which is equal to an object. And inside here, I might have a key data, which is just an array, for example, okay? And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a reducer. So const user equals an arrow function. And the first argument is the state it's going to be managing, which is going to be equal to the initial state. The second argument is action, which is going to allow us to access all of our actions. We don't have any actions right now, so I'm going to go ahead for now and just return state. And lastly, I will export default state here, okay? So that's a simple reducer setup. I can come back to my store now, and I can import that reducer we just created. And now I can tell my store, hey, here is the user reducer that's going to be managing the state inside you, okay? I'll probably rename this to make this a bit more clear. User is a bit vague, so we'll call it user reducer. And whoops, export default user reducer. So I'll go ahead and import that, and then just change the names. Just make it a bit more semantic. So now I have my reducer, I have my store. I don't have any actions yet. What I am going to show you guys, this is a full stack app, so we're going to be interacting with our backend. So I will have to do that via an AJAX request, and I'll be setting that up in a moment. For now, I'm not going to create an action is what I'm saying. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come into my index.js, which is our React here, and I need to tell React about Redux, because right now it doesn't know about Redux. So I need to go ahead and import the provider, and that's coming from the React Redux library, which is a library that basically makes it easy for us to use React with Redux. and it has this thing called the provider. Now, what the provider is for is, it does what it says in its name. It's telling our app, hey, here's the state, here's the store, excuse me, that will be providing the state. So I need to put the provider here, and I need to wrap the component that is being first rendered when my app loads, so i.e. in my index.js. So by doing this now, my app, which is my React app, knows about the provider. Now, it still doesn't know what store. So when you're using the provider, you need to give it a prop store and let it equal to your store that you created. So we created a store in our store.js, and I exported it here. So I can go ahead and come back to my index and go ahead and import that store. And that's coming from my store.js. And now I can tell the provider, hey, the store that's going to be providing the state for this app or React app is going to be our store, which we imported on line 7. So at this point, React now knows about the Redux store, okay? That's the whole job of the provider. So if I save that, at this point, I should be pretty good to go. I haven't actually even started my development server. So we'll go ahead and do that, yarn start or npm start, either or is fine. And we have no errors, so that's a good start. So we have no errors in our console, so that's a good start too. And just bring that up there, cool. So I'll come to my Redux dev tools, which I like to use, and we will get an error here saying that there's no store found. Make sure to follow the instructions. And I spent a bit of time Googling this when I was first doing the Redux dev tools, and you have to read, right? As developers, sometimes we don't read between the lines here, and it's right in front of me. Please follow the instructions. So make sure, again, take your time and read through everything. Once I click that, it brings me here to the Redux docs here, dev tools. And I'm just going to add this line of code to when I create my store, which is in here. And this is going to be my second argument. And that will enable my dev tools to work, okay? So at this point, we can see that my state is the key of data, which is an empty array, because that's what we set up in a user reducer, okay? So at this point, we have React, Redux kind of set up. We have a backend set up. Now, I want to, for this demo, this endpoint we created here, I would like to make an AJAX request to my backend and get back the data and put it in my Redux state, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my backend, and I'm actually just going to open this here as well. Let's see, open. Full 19, full stack and server. Oh, it's already open. I just want to put these guys side by side. Okay, that's what I'm going to do. Make a nice little setup here. So I'm going to put my client on the left and my server on the right. And I'll just make these a bit smaller. Let me know if that's too small, by the way, guys. So I want my client on the left and my server on the right. I like to work this way so I can kind of see my front end and I can see my back end. Okay, so I'm going to go to my backend for a second because at the start of this workshop, I created an endpoint called test, and I just send back a JSON response. Realistically, you would probably use Mongoose here or Connects to get the data from your database, which is going to be your bonus task today. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hard code in a variable users, let's say, which is an array of objects, and I'll just have 2 objects here, okay? And I'm just going to send back a JSON response of users when someone hits that endpoint. I'll just test it out by going here and refreshing. So we have our array of objects once we hit this endpoint here. So I'm going to come back to my code, and we're going to come back to the front end. I just wanted to update my endpoint on the back end. So the idea here is from the front end, I want to make an AJAX request to my back end, and I would expect to get back these users, okay? To do that, we need to create an action in Redux, and I'm going to create my actions file called index.js. And this action is going to be an asynchronous action, okay? So this is a nice little review if we're going to review right now what asynchronous actions are in Redux. So asynchronous actions allow us to do asynchronous stuff, essentially, inside the action. A lot of the times you usually use it for making AJAX requests. So to be able to do that, I need to configure my store to tell it that I'm going to be using asynchronous actions. And I'm going to be using a library called Redux Tunc, which I installed. So I can go ahead and import that from Redux Tunc. And I'm going to be importing something called apply middleware from Redux as well, okay? So if I make this a bit bigger here so we can see. So when I create my store, the first argument is the user reducer. The second argument is this code to launch my dev tools. And the third argument is apply middleware. And this apply middleware method from Redux is basically asking you what middlewares or what libraries do you want to apply to the store. There's a few different libraries. In reality, usually what I use and what a lot of people use is Redux Tunc. So you can use asynchronous actions. You can get other libraries called Redux Logger, which just logs everything to your dev tools when an action happens. But personally, I find it gets a bit annoying because it bloats my console. So for now, we're going to use Redux Tunc. So I have Tunc imported, so I can put that as the argument here. And now my store knows about Redux Tunc. Why do we have to use Redux Tunc? Because it allows us to create asynchronous actions, which is what we need to do to make an AJAX request to our server. So I'm going to close my store. I'm going to close my reducer, get nice and organized here, close my app, close my index, and I'm in my actions file. So let's create an action. I'm going to export const fetch users is what I'm going to call it. It's going to be equal to a function. I'm going to write this syntax the long way. I'm not going to get fancy with ES6 features here. And this is our action creator. Now, usually inside here, you'd be used to doing a synchronous action, which would return an object with a type property and some payload here. But because it's asynchronous, we're not going to be returning an object. We're going to return a function inside this action. So this is what Redux Tunc is. You basically return a function within a function. This is our action, and now we're returning a function within here so we can do some async stuff, okay? Now, this function is given an argument called dispatch with Redux Tunc, and dispatch, like you know it from the components from this week, it's how we dispatch actions. Why I use that here will become apparent towards the end of this AJAX, okay? So you can ignore this guy for now, and we will explain it. It becomes apparent. At this point, I would start setting up my AJAX request here, okay? And I'm going to be using the fetch library to make my AJAX request. And I have to give this a URL. So I could just hard code in the URL here, and it will be fine. But I don't want to do that because when I go to production, I'm going to have to come back and change this URL. So it just becomes a bit messy. So what we like to do in the industry is we like to create a config file. And I'll create a config.js here in my source. And inside here, I will export const a variable called, you can call this whatever you want, but I'm going to call it API base URL. And that's going to be equal to a env, which we'll set up when we're in production. And it has to start with React app, FYI, when you're creating envs for create React app, it must start with React app, okay? After this, I can call it whatever I want. So I'll call it API base URL. And if that's not set up, i.e. when we're working locally, we're going to use localhost 8080. Okay. So I've set up that config file with my API base URL variable. And I can go back to my action. And now at the top of my action file, I can go ahead and I can import, whoops, just uncapitalize that, import my API base URL from my config file. So I need to come up a directory, config.js. Okay. You notice this guy is kind of like all uppercase underscore. You don't have to do that. It's just good practice when you're naming like config variables to have them this convention, this naming convention. So you don't get mixed up with just another variable like camel case, okay? So it kind of stands out. So now that I have that in here, I can refactor this a small bit, and I can use a backtick, and I can say API base URL, and that is going to be localhost 8080. So that will be fine, but our endpoint is going to be API, let's just say, rename it to users. I need to go to API base URL / API / users, okay? And then, .then, in the fetch library, we would expect to get back a response that we will go ahead and parse it to JSON. This is just from the fetch library. You need to make sure that the response is JSON. And once that has been converted, .then, we would expect the JSON, which we'll call users because we're going to expect to get back users. At this point, I'll always console log the response from my API. If I wanted to, I could also add a catch here if anything blew up so we could see a bit more detail. And that's my fetch request, okay? So I have an action fetch users, and this action, instead of returning a type property immediately, it's making an AJAX request to our API base URL, which is localhost 8080 / API / users. We would expect that, I put these side by side so we could clearly see the story here. We would expect that to go to our server, and it's going to look for an endpoint of API, which is here, / users. And then we created the users variable and we send it back as JSON. So all going well, we would expect to see that, okay, in our console log here. Now, it's all well and good me creating this action, but if I come back to my app, just to probably should have checked if I had any errors. I don't, which is good. We'll notice we don't see anything in the console because I haven't used that action yet. So I'm going to need to use the action. In this app, when it loads, I would like to just fire, or the correct terminology is I would like to dispatch that action without the user having to do anything. So I can come into my app.js, which we know is rendered from my index here to start off the React app. That's how we're seeing our UI here in the app.js. So all this JSX. I can go ahead and dispatch the action from here. So to do that, I need to have access to the dispatcher, and I only get that when the component has been connected to Redux. So I need to connect the component to Redux. So let's go ahead and import the connect method from React Redux. And at the bottom, I'm going to connect a parentheses, which we're going to leave empty because we're not going to use map state to props here. We're not getting any data from the state yet. And now this component is connected to Redux. So up here, I'm going to do a console log of this.props. And I can see now that my props, it now has the dispatcher, okay? I got that via props because I connected my component to Redux, okay? So I'm going to get rid of my log. And what I'm going to do is, I remember I talked to you guys last week a bit about lifecycle methods. So I'm going to use the component mount, which is going to run when the component loads for the first time. And inside this component, inside this component mount, excuse me, I'm basically going to dispatch the action that we created a moment ago called fetch users, okay? So to do that, the action, otherwise it won't know what I'm talking about. So fetch users is going to be imported from our actions file, actions folder / index.js. I don't need index.js because the compiler will default to look for an index.js. You can put it in if you want, that's no problem. So at this point, I've imported my action, and now I can go ahead and do this.props, and we know we have to dispatch via props. And that now is expecting you to tell it which action to dispatch. In this case, fetch users, please, parentheses. When this component loads, it's going to go ahead and dispatch an action fetch users. And that comes to our actions here, and it's going to call this action. Now, inside here, we're returning a function with the dispatch, which we're not going to use for now. We'll talk about that in a moment. And inside here, it's making a fetch request to API base URL / API / users. And all going well, we're going to log the response, okay? So we can see in our console, we have our response, which is awesome. And it's that array of objects that we created on the back end. So at this point, my app is now talking to my backend. Okay. And again, you guys will be going through these steps. I know it might seem like a lot of moving parts. You will be doing what I'm doing right now, so you'll get another chance. And I'll also be around to kind of go through it. The main thing is a mental kind of roadmap is we start at the index.js here to have a look at what's happening in our React app. And then we make our way down the mountain, then we follow the story. So inside my app, I dispatched an action. And the next thing to do is to go to that action that I created. That goes to my back end, which goes to this endpoint here. And then it sends back a response. So the next step is it comes back to here, and we're logging that response here. Okay. Now, I have my data here, as we can see, but I want to put that into, right now it's empty. So I know that users is an array of objects. So what I could do is I could create another action called, let's say, fetch user success. And that's equal to an arrow function. And I want to immediately return something. So I'll do a parentheses after the arrow. And I'll return an object with a type property. And I would say fetch users success. And then I would expect to pass this action my users. So I'll name the argument users and the payload users, okay? So this is a synchronous action, which has the type. The reason I did this in the first place is when we get the data back, I want to put it into my state. So to put it into my state, that's the reducer's responsibility. And the reducer only does something when an action with a type property has been dispatched, okay? So going back to the point of why we have dispatch here, dispatch is given to us by Redux Tunc for asynchronous actions. And like in the component, we dispatch an action called fetch users. It's exactly the same thing. We can now dispatch an action from within here. For example, if I come down and replace my console log, I want to fire this action here, fetch user success. So I can do dispatch fetch user success, passing users as an argument. When I get a response, I'm using the dispatch here and taking advantage of it to dispatch an action called fetch user success, passing the users, which is my response, to this action. So now this action runs, and users is equal to what I passed it. It has my type property, and now the payload is equal to whatever I pass in. So at this stage, I have dispatched that action with my users. So now I can go to my reducer, which is here, and I can update this a little bit. Right now we're returning state, but what I want to do is I want to say if the action.type equals fetch user success, I want to update the state. If no action happens, just return state. So at this point, I'm going to split these guys to the right here, make it nice so we can see it. Okay. So at this point, I have dispatched my fetch user success action once I get a response. It has my type. So in my reducer, I'm listening for that type. And once that happens, I'm going to update the state. So I'm going to return a new object. I'm going to use the spread operator to copy the previous state. And then I'm going to say data is going to be equal to action.users. Action.users coming from that action fetch user success, which is our array of objects. If I wanted to, and you have been doing this as well, this is just my style, you can go ahead and use the object.assign here, which would look like so. Object.assign, return a new object, copy the state, and update data to be equal to action.users. So you can use either style there to update the state. I just like this style. It just looks cleaner on my eye, but you can absolutely use object.assign as well. So at this point, I have my response. I've dispatched my fetch user success. My reducer is listening for that action. And when it's dispatched, which is here, it's going to update my state. And in this case, it's going to update that data, with whatever the value is of action.users. Okay, so let's come back to my browser. And I'm going to just refresh. I can see it here. But if I go to my state, we can now see that data has my array of objects. Okay, so I've got the data from my backend. I put it into my Redux state. The last piece to this puzzle is showing the data on the UI. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just use my app.js again because it's already connected to Redux. And I'm going to use the map state to props function. So a nice little refresher on map state to props function that's going to be given our state from Redux. And it's going to return an object. And now we just have to tell the Connect that we're going to be using it. And inside here, we're going to be creating a prop that's equal to something in the state. So in this case, I can create a prop called users, which I could name whatever I want. And it's going to be equal to state.user_reducer.data. Because in our state, you can also, by the way, in these dev tools, they're pretty awesome. You can look at like the chart, which is pretty cool. And you can also look at raw. So you can kind of see that our state is an object with a data key. And we have data here, okay? So my linking is actually incorrect. It's just going to be state.data because I'm not using multiple reducers. It's just going to be state.data. So inside here, what I can do now is I will put a console log of this.props just to see if I've set up everything correctly. Okay, and you can see initially the users is empty because it has to get the data from the UI. And now when it comes back, we can see our prop users now has our data. Okay, so at this point, what I can do is I can show that on the UI. So I could just create a variable here, const users is equal to this.props.users.map. We'll name each one user and index. And for each one, we will return an LI that has a key prop. We need to give a key to everything we map over to make it unique for React. We'll let that equal to index. And inside here, we'll just do user. So now when I come down to my component in my return, I can put a UL here. And inside the UL, I will use the variable users. So all going well. I know I kind of went through that quickly, guys. Again, this is like, you'll be doing this today. So any points throughout this talk that you don't understand, just grab me and we'll go through it, okay? So save, and then we'll refresh. And we do have an error. This error here, actually a good point to mention. I've come across, it's caused me a lot of headache in the past. The error is, because I said user here, and user, each user is an object with a name property. So I cannot render the whole object to the UI. That's what it's barking at me for. So I need to dig in and just render a name. You cannot spit out the whole object to the UI, okay? So now you can see my data is on the UI. And at this point, we have like a full working stack of React Redux, Node Express, okay? So what I need to do now, just to kind of last 20 minutes here or so, I need to deploy both these apps. But before I do that, maybe I'll just open the floor for a few moments, just for a few questions. If there's anything anyone wants me to go over really quickly, or if not, you can grab me after and we can get on a call and go through it. We'll get a drink of water as well while thinking. Okay. I'll go ahead and continue on. So guys, so we'll come back to our primer, and this is going to be your exercise for today. So I'm just going to skip over this part because you're going to be working with cheeses, and I'm going to come down here to deploy your server. So I'm not going to be using Travis. You guys don't need to use Travis. I do personally have a video on how to set up Travis with React, and I'll make one on Node for you. So I can give you that after, but for the purpose of the workshop and for today, you don't have to set up Travis, okay? We're going to be deploying to Heroku directly for our backend, and we're going to be deploying to Netlify directly for our front end. So let's deploy our backend. Let's come back here, and I'm going to come in here, and you can see our logs. That's Morgan, just telling us every request. And I'm in my server, and what I can do is I can do a Heroku create to create my Heroku app. And what I can do now is I can simply just do git add. Let's do git add period, because we made some changes. Git commit -m. I'll just say refactoring simplicity. I'll do git push so it goes to my repository. And then lastly, I'll do git push Heroku master. So that's going to now push our code up to Heroku. So in terms of deploying the backend, it's two commands really. Heroku create only once to create a Heroku app. And then you don't have to do that again once you redeploy. And then secondly, you just do git push Heroku master. And that's pretty much it then. It's pretty straightforward to deploy the backend, which is really nice. So this is going to build and it's going to go to Heroku. And it looks like everything was okay, which is good news. So I can do Heroku open, and this will open up that site for me. And we have an error, which is fine because we don't have an initial endpoint, but I do have API/users, and we can see we have our array of objects, okay? So the backend is deployed, which is pretty awesome. Now, there is one thing I will need to do in a little while. I'll need to tell my server about my front-end production URL, because remember we have this cores in our server.js, and that's going to look for this variable, which is equal to an env, which will be setting up in a little while, but for now it's going to default to localhost 3000. So that will work perfectly locally, but when we're in production, localhost 3000 won't be where our AJAX requests are coming from. They'll be coming from Netlify, so that's going to break. Now, at this point, my backend is deployed, guys, so I can move over and we can focus and switch gears to deploy the front end. So we can see here they have a few points. Make sure your client is configured to access data and a link to the curriculum. So I'd advise you to click this, obviously. We're going to create a redirects file in our public folder. So I'm going to go to my public here, and I'm going to create that file. The reason I have to create this file here and put in this code is when we use React Router, if you have multiple pages on your websites, it'll just make sure on Netlify that you don't get a not found. That can happen. You'll go to your route and everything you think will be set up perfectly, and it'll say 404 not found. And you could spend a while debugging and wondering what's going on. And Netlify in their docs just say to add this redirects file to the public folder with this code. So it just makes sure basically to find your index HTML, which is here. And we know that that has the div ID root, which React kind of attaches onto, which starts your React app. So it's just for the routing on their server that it makes sure it knows what you're talking about, okay? So once we've done that, the next step here is I can go ahead and create a production build here, which I can do React app API base URL equals, okay, so let's go ahead and do that. So React app API base URL, I'm going to come to my command line. I'm going to come into my client. I'll just shut down the development server. React app API base URL. So what I'm doing here is I'm essentially creating an env now. We know this on my front end in the config file. Let's see. We create this API base URL, which is equal to an env of this. And locally, it's going to use 8080. So right now, I'm basically creating that env, React app API base URL, and that's going to be equal to our backend production URL, which is on Heroku, which is this guy here, okay? So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to come back here, put it in quotes just to be safe. And after I do that, I can do npm run build, which to create React app will basically build all our code into a build folder, so it'll be ready to be pushed up to production. It's going to minify our code and make it more efficient. So go ahead and click that. Just make sure that's okay. And while that's doing, so it looks like it's good. So if I come back to my code base here, my Atom sometimes does not like to update, but you should see a build folder here, okay? I'm going to come back to the next step here on client. So we've done this step. npm install netlify CLI. This is the CLI for your command line to use Netlify, like we used Heroku for the backend. I have it installed already, so I'm not going to do it again. But when you run the next command, Netlify create, if you get an error, you most likely forgot to install the CLI. So just again, most important thing is step by step. Take your time, it's not a race, and go through every step very slowly. So I've done this already, so I'm going to go forward and create my Netlify app here for my front end by running Netlify create. And we'll notice in my code base, it's now added a Netlify file with my site ID, which I'm going to be using in a moment. So I can come back to the instructions, and it says, deploy your app using this command here. So I'm going to copy this command, and I'm going to put it here for now because I'm going to be adjusting it. So Netlify deploy, it's using a command from the Netlify CLI called deploy -p.build. So it's going to be taking our build folder, basically, which is not showing up in my Atom, but it is there when we ran npm run build. And my token is going to be my access token. So I need to replace this, and how I'm going to get that, as you can see, your access token comes from here. So I can copy this line, and I can come back to my command line, and I can use cat, copy, and then paste it to the command line. And you can see now it pastes an object with my access token. So I can copy this, come back to my code, and I can paste that there. And I now need my site ID. So my site ID, I can grab that here from the Netlify file that I'm in, which is .netlify. And I'm going to grab this guy here without the quotes, just to be safe. And I'm going to put that there. And now I'm going to get rid of this junk at the end. Cool. So now this line of code is going to deploy our app. So I'm going to copy. I'm going to come back and I'm going to paste. I'm going to click enter. And Netlify deploys pretty quickly, actually. So that's it. Now our client is deployed. So I can go ahead and, like Heroku open, I can do Netlify open. That'll bring me to my dashboard. And I can get my URL here. I'm going to copy that for later. And I can go to my website. And you can now see our app is built, okay? Which is nice. Now, you notice at this point, they're both deployed. Again, those steps you'll be going through. So don't worry if that was a bit quick. You will be going through this, your task today. So you'll notice here, locally, we have some users, right? Let's just refresh here. I stopped my server, actually, so it's not going to show. But a moment ago, we had users showing up here. If I open my dev tools, I'm going to have an error or warning. And you can see this, which is very common, and it's very frustrating if you don't know fully what's going on. Cores can be quite painful to work with. What this is saying to me is, it's trying to make an AJAX request to this URL, which is our backend, which is correct. But the backend basically is not allowing my front end, which is here, to access it. It doesn't know. So it's like knocking on the door. It's like, sorry, go away. I don't know who you are. Because you can see the URL being sent over is localhost 3000, but that's not right because this is our production URL. Now, if we go back to my front end, and in my actions file where I make the AJAX request, I do API base URL, okay, which is going to go to my Heroku, which is fine. But on my backend, if I go to my index.js, I talked about this at the start, but this line of code here, app.use, cores, origin. So right now, it's thinking that the origin is 3000, which it's not, obviously. So in my config file, the client origin, we need to basically create an env, okay? Because it's not created right now, and that's what's happening. It's defaulting to use 3000. So to create an env, I can do it on Heroku itself. You can go to the dashboard. I'm just trying to, what's this one called here? Storm, they have some crazy names. Stormy Journey. So that's this one here. And I could go into the app and I could go to settings. I could go to reveal config varies and I could do it here, guys. And you're absolutely fine if you do that. Another way to do it is you can always do it through the command line using the Heroku CLI. So you can do Heroku config : set. The env key, which I would put in basically here, would be client underscore origin, and the URL is going to be my front end Netlify URL, which is like so. And if I go ahead and click enter, it's now going to set up that env. If I refresh, I actually believe it should show here now. So we can see now we've client origin, okay? So all going well, going back to our live site and we refresh here, we can now see we're getting our data because the backend now knows about this URL, which is our front end, because we set up that env, okay? So at this point, everything's set up. I'm kind of good to go in terms of like if I hadn't done already, I would be creating my wireframes and my user stories and getting an idea of what I'm actually building and what I'm going to allocate each day to. For example, day 1 and 2, I might work on authentication. Day 2, I might work on the dashboard, and then I might leave styling to the end. So just getting really, really organized, okay? Because my code is nice and set up now, okay? So the toughest thing today, I think, like when I was doing this, the idea of these env variables, like what I did there, setting up an env, if you get that CORS issue, you just have not set up an env, okay? That's a good mental note. If you get that CORS issue and you're wondering why it's not working in production. So just nearly out of time here. This morning, you guys are going to be working solo, and essentially the task is to walk through this. So you're going to be doing what I just did there, and you're going to be working on a cheese app. So you're going to be sick of the word cheese by the end of the day. And that's the task for today. I'll be on Slack, obviously, for support until the TAs get on later on. So if you need me, just, as always, issue a ticket in the support channel, okay? Other than that, I'll let you go, and I'll stick around for a few minutes here if there's any questions. If not, just grab me on the support channel. Okay, guys? No worries. I need to get some water now. My mouth is so dry from talking.